A phone rings in a cockpit over Iranian airspace. On the ground, an aircraft carrying one of Iran's most senior officials is seconds from a decision that could rewrite the next 20 years of the Middle East. Somewhere else, in a quiet government office 3,000 miles away, a different kind of alarm is going off. Not a missile warning, but a diplomatic one. And when the story of that day finally reaches the public, one government will call it history. Another will call it fiction. This is the story of a war that never fully ended, a ceasefire that never fully held, and a warning that may have stopped an assassination from becoming the spark that reignited everything. To understand why a single newspaper report could shake three governments at once, you have to go back to the moment the shooting was supposed to stop. Earlier this year, after weeks of devastating strikes between Israel and Iran, a ceasefire was signed. On paper, it looked like relief. In practice, it was closer to a held breath. Wars rarely end with a signature. They end when both sides run out of reasons to keep fighting, or when someone forces them to stop before they destroy the very people who might one day negotiate peace. This was the second kind of ending, and it was fragile from the very first hour. Because here is the uncomfortable truth about modern warfare. Killing the enemy's soldiers is one thing. Killing the enemy's negotiators is something else entirely. A soldier can be replaced. A negotiator who understands the other side, who has spent months building the fragile trust required to sit across a table from an adversary, cannot be replaced overnight. Remove that person, and you don't just win a battle. You may destroy the only bridge left standing. That is precisely the danger American officials say they saw forming, according to reporting that surfaced this week. Two names sit at the center of this story: Abbas Araghchi, Iran's foreign minister, and Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Iran's parliament. Both men had become, whether by choice or by necessity, the human face of Iran's side of the negotiating table. Both men, according to officials familiar with the matter, had also become potential targets. Rewind to the early weeks of the war. Israel's campaign inside Iran was not limited to military infrastructure. It reached into the highest levels of the regime itself. Iran's supreme leader was killed. So was the country's top national security official. So was a former foreign minister. One by one, the people who might have eventually sat down and talked were being removed from the equation, sometimes before anyone in Washington had even decided whether talking was still possible. There's a particular kind of psychological warfare embedded in that strategy, and it's worth pausing on. When you eliminate not just the fighters, but the potential peacemakers, you are sending a message that goes far beyond the battlefield. You are saying, there is no version of this where we sit across from you. There is only submission or destruction. It is a strategy built on pressure, not patience. And pressure, history shows again and again, can force short-term capitulation, but it rarely builds a lasting peace. The American president, according to multiple reports, understood this danger with unusual clarity. At one point, when asked directly who the United States was even negotiating with inside Iran, he reportedly avoided naming names. Not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because he didn't want to hand anyone a target list. His own words, paraphrased from officials who described the exchange, captured the absurdity of the moment. It had become genuinely difficult to identify a living Iranian official worth negotiating with, because so many had already been killed. Let that sink in for a moment. A ceasefire built on the assumption that both sides have someone left to talk to, and a war that had been steadily narrowing that list to almost nobody. This is the backdrop against which the alleged warning took place. According to a major American newspaper's investigation, cited later by outlets including NBC News and CNN, U.S. officials became convinced in the weeks following the initial ceasefire that Israel might be preparing to target Arakshi and Galibaf directly. Not as collateral damage in a broader strike, specifically, deliberately, as the two men most responsible for keeping diplomacy alive. The reported plan, according to these accounts, involved a moment when Galibaf was flying back to Tehran after meetings in Islamabad, where he had discussed the situation with the American vice president. On that return flight, sources say, Iranian security personnel received intelligence suggesting that two Israeli fighter jets had entered Iranian airspace from Iraq, potentially positioned to intercept the aircraft. Picture that scene for a moment, stripped of politics. A commercial-style flight carrying a senior government official suddenly diverting mid-air. Not because of weather, not because of mechanical failure, because someone, somewhere, believed the plane itself might be the target. The aircraft made an emergency landing in northeastern Iran, and the delegation reportedly completed the rest of the journey by road, an 8-hour drive through a country still recovering from active war, surrounded by the uncertainty of not knowing whether the threat had passed or simply paused. That is not a footnote. That is the kind of moment that, if it had gone differently, could have unraveled every fragile agreement holding the region together. And this is where the story becomes less about a single flight and more about the architecture of trust, or the absence of it, between allies. Because if the reporting is accurate, it means the United States, publicly standing beside Israel as a close ally throughout this conflict, was privately worried enough about Israeli intentions that it took the extraordinary step of warning the other side. Not through official channels between Washington and Tehran, which barely exist, but indirectly through intermediaries in other countries across the region, asking them to pass the warning along. Think about what that reveals. Allies do not typically warn their partners' adversaries about their partner's own plans. That happens only when the ally believes the action in question would cause more harm than good, not to the enemy, but to the broader strategy the ally itself is trying to protect. In other words, this wasn't an act of betrayal. According to this interpretation, it was an act of damage control. Washington, according to these accounts, wasn't trying to protect Iran. It was trying to protect the negotiations it had spent months trying to build. Negotiations it saw as fragile enough to be destroyed by a single assassination. This is the part of geopolitics that rarely makes headlines, because it isn't dramatic in the way missile strikes are dramatic. It's quieter. It's about incentives, and incentives, more than ideology, often explain why powerful nations do things that look, on the surface, contradictory. Now add another layer to this. There is historical precedent for exactly this kind of concern. Reports referenced in this same coverage recall an earlier moment, months before this specific incident, when a foreign government, reportedly Pakistan, is said to have privately urged the United States to ask Israel to remove Araki and Galibaf from any target list. The reasoning given, according to that earlier account, was blunt. If both men were killed, there would be no one left on the Iranian side capable of negotiating anything at all. Washington, according to this version of events, relayed that concern to Israel, and for a period, the threat against those two men reportedly receded. If true, that means this wasn't a single isolated warning. It was part of a pattern, a recurring, high-stakes tug-of-war between military opportunity and diplomatic necessity, playing out again and again behind closed doors while the public saw only ceasefires, statements, and here is where the story takes its sharpest turn. When this reporting became public, Israel's response was immediate. and it was not measured. The Prime Minister's office rejected the entire account outright, calling it, in a public statement, fake news, a complete fabrication of reality. No qualification, no partial correction, a total denial. Now, from a communications standpoint, that kind of blanket denial is worth examining carefully, because it is a strategic choice, not just an emotional reaction. There are, broadly speaking, two ways a government can respond to an uncomfortable report. It can dispute specific details while acknowledging a kernel of truth, which invites follow-up questions and keeps the story alive. Or it can reject the entire premise in absolute terms, which is designed to end the conversation in one sentence. The second approach is higher risk, because if even part of the underlying reporting turns out to be verifiable, the flat denial becomes the headline instead of the original story. But it is also, in the short term, the more effective way to dominate a single news cycle. It gives reporters, allies, and the public one clear message to repeat, rather than a nuanced set of half-truths to untangle. This is not unique to this moment. It's a recognizable pattern in how governments manage sensitive intelligence stories. Confirm nothing. Deny everything. Let the news cycle move on before deeper questions can be asked. Whether that is what happened here is something the public may never know with certainty. But the shape of the response fits a familiar strategic template used by states around the world when classified or sensitive operational matters leak into public view. What makes this particular denial more complicated, though, is the surrounding context that was already public before this report even surfaced. Because this was not the first time concerns about Israeli strikes on negotiating counterparts had been raised. Months earlier, in a separate and widely covered incident, Israel struck a location in Doha, Qatar, where members of a rival negotiating team had gathered specifically to discuss a ceasefire proposal. That strike happened in a different context, against a different group, but it left behind a lingering question that hasn't gone away. Is there a strategic willingness, in certain circumstances, to treat the negotiating table itself as a legitimate target? Once that question exists in the public record, any new report alleging a similar pattern lands differently than it would in isolation. It doesn't need to be proven from scratch. It only needs to fit a shape people already recognize. This is one of the most important things to understand about information warfare in modern conflicts. Credibility is not built or destroyed by a single event. It's built cumulatively, story by story, until a pattern either solidifies or falls apart. A single denial can win a single day. It cannot erase an established pattern of behavior, real or perceived, that has already taken shape in the minds of journalists, allied governments, and the public. And this is where the tension between Washington and Jerusalem becomes impossible to ignore. Because it was not limited to this one incident. Reports throughout this period describe growing friction between the Trump administration and the Israeli government over the direction of the war, and specifically over continued strikes in Lebanon targeting Iran-backed Hezbollah forces, even after multiple ceasefire agreements had already been signed. At various points, American officials reportedly disavowed those actions publicly, urging restraint even as fighting continued. American intelligence assessments, according to reporting from that period, concluded that further Israeli strikes on Hezbollah were likely regardless, a prediction that itself threatened to derail the broader peace process the United States was trying to protect. Even more striking, the American vice president reportedly became one of the most vocal internal critics of hardline elements within the Israeli government, at one point addressing members of Netanyahu's cabinet directly and arguing, in essence, that military force alone cannot resolve every national security problem a country faces. That is an extraordinary statement for a sitting American vice president to make publicly about the internal strategy of one of the country's closest allies. It signals something deeper than disagreement over tactics. It signals a fundamental divergence in philosophy about what winning even means in a conflict like this one. Here is the strategic tension at the heart of the entire story, and it's worth stating plainly because it explains almost everything else. Israel's stated security doctrine, built over decades of experience with regional threats, treats the elimination of enemy leadership as one of the most effective tools available, a way of degrading an adversary's capability and resolve simultaneously. Washington, meanwhile, was trying to end an active war through negotiation, and negotiation requires, by definition, the survival of people willing to negotiate. These are not automatically incompatible goals, but in specific individual moments, they can collide directly. And when they do, someone has to choose which priority wins in that instant. According to this reporting, in at least this one instance, Washington chose diplomacy over deterrence and moved to protect the individuals whose survival it believed diplomacy required. That single choice, more than any single missile or ceasefire signature, may say more about where real power sits in this relationship than any public statement ever could. Because ultimately, alliances are not tested by agreement. They are tested by disagreement, and by what each side is willing to do when their interests genuinely diverge. An ally who only supports you when your interests already align isn't really being tested at all. The moments that reveal the true structure of a relationship are the ones where support requires friction, where loyalty requires saying no. So where does this leave things now? At the time of this reporting, diplomatic engagement was continuing, even amid the noise of the denial. Talks involving Qatari and Pakistani mediators with both American and Iranian negotiators had reportedly produced what officials described as positive progress on the broader framework guiding the ceasefire. Even as the hardest issues, including the future of Iran's nuclear program, remained unresolved and pushed further down the road. Meanwhile, on a separate and almost jarring note, Israeli and American leaders reportedly agreed to meet in person in the near future, a reminder that even amid public friction and furious denials, the underlying alliance between these two nations remains, for now, structurally intact. That contrast is worth sitting with for a moment. Public denial and private cooperation, existing at the very same time, are not actually a contradiction. They are how modern diplomacy often works. Governments can disagree sharply behind closed doors, deny that disagreement publicly, and still continue cooperating on the broader strategic relationship that both sides need to survive. The theater of denial and the substance of the relationship are not always the same performance. There's a broader lesson buried inside this story, one that extends well beyond Iran, Israel, or the United States. In any high-stakes negotiation, between nations, between companies, even between people, there is a difference between the stated position and the underlying interest. The stated position here was unity, two allies standing together against a shared adversary. The underlying interest, at least in this specific episode, was more complicated. An ally trying to prevent its partner from making a decision it believed would be catastrophic for everyone involved, including itself. And this raises the uncomfortable question that sits underneath the entire story, one without a clean answer. If the reporting is accurate, what does it mean that the closest ally of a warring nation felt it necessary to warn that nation's enemy about that nation's own alleged plans? Is that an act of restraint, designed to save lives and preserve a fragile peace? Or is it an admission that trust between these two governments has eroded to the point where one no longer believes the other can be controlled through ordinary diplomatic channels alone? Perhaps the answer is both, depending on which side of the relationship you're standing on. What we do know is this: two men, one a foreign minister, the other a parliamentary speaker, are reportedly still alive today, in part because of a warning that traveled quietly through intermediaries rather than official statements. A ceasefire that could have collapsed in a single mid-air interception instead held, at least for now. And a story that could have stayed buried in classified briefings instead became public, forcing three governments to respond, deny, clarify, and calculate, all within the span of a single news cycle. Wars are remembered for their battles, but the moments that actually determine whether peace holds are almost always quieter than that. They happen in intermediary phone calls, in warnings passed through third countries, in split-second decisions about whether to fire or to wait. History rarely gives us the full transcript of those moments. It gives us fragments, official denials, and reporters piecing together what they can from officials who were willing to talk. To really grasp why this single episode carries so much weight, it helps to step back and look at the machinery of modern intelligence sharing itself. Because almost none of it happens the way movies portray it. There is no single hotline connecting Washington and Tehran. There is no ambassador quietly relaying messages over tea. When the United States wants to warn Iran about something, it typically cannot simply call and say so. Decades of severed diplomatic relations mean that even a life or death warning has to travel sideways, through third parties willing to serve as go-betweens, through countries with their own interests, their own credibility to protect, and their own reasons for agreeing to pass a message along in the first place. That detail alone should change how you read this entire story. A warning that has to travel through 2 or 3 intermediary governments before it reaches its intended recipient is not a fast warning. It is not a precise one either. Details can be softened in translation. Urgency can be lost in bureaucratic caution. And by the time the message actually reaches the person it's meant to protect, the window to act on it may already be closing. If Kalibov's flight really was diverted based on intelligence passed through exactly this kind of indirect channel, then the fact that it worked at all, that the warning arrived in time and was believed, is almost as remarkable as the alleged threat itself. There's a psychological dimension here too, one that rarely gets discussed in coverage focused purely on strikes and statements. Imagine being one of these two men, negotiating on behalf of a country at war, knowing that your own government has already lost its top security official, its supreme leader, and other senior figures to targeted strikes. Every flight becomes a calculation. Every meeting abroad becomes a risk assessment. You are simultaneously trying to represent your nation's interests at the negotiating table, while privately wondering whether simply doing your job makes you a target. That kind of pressure does not just test a negotiator's patience. It tests their judgment, their willingness to compromise, and their trust in the very process they are supposedly there to support. Negotiators operating under threat of assassination do not negotiate the same way negotiators operating in safety do. Fear changes the shape of diplomacy itself, often in ways that are invisible to the public watching from the outside. And this brings us to a broader truth about asymmetric warfare that this entire episode illustrates almost perfectly. When one side possesses overwhelming military and intelligence superiority, it faces a strategic temptation that weaker adversaries rarely have to consider. The temptation is this: why negotiate patiently over months when you could simply remove the people you're negotiating with and force a different outcome entirely? It is a tempting shortcut because, on paper, it looks efficient. Remove the obstacle, solve the problem. But history has shown, again and again, in conflicts far beyond this one, that removing negotiators rarely removes the underlying conflict. It only removes the immediate mechanism for ending it, often replacing a known, somewhat pragmatic counterpart with an unknown successor who may be more hardline, more cautious, or simply less experienced at finding common ground. In trying to win faster, the stronger side can accidentally guarantee a longer war. This is precisely the strategic risk that American officials, according to this reporting, appear to have understood and feared. It is not that Washington suddenly develops sympathy for the other side's officials. It is that strategists, watching a pattern of eliminations unfold, may have concluded that continuing down this path would not bring the war to a faster, cleaner end. It would simply remove the last remaining off-ramp, leaving both sides trapped in an escalating cycle with no clear path back toward stability. That is not protection of an adversary. That is protection of an exit strategy, one that the warning nation itself desperately needed the war to have. It's also worth examining why this story broke into public view at all, because leaks of this sensitivity do not happen randomly. Someone, somewhere within the government where the story originated, decided that this information needed to reach the public, whether out of concern for accountability, frustration with an ally's conduct, internal political maneuvering, or some combination of all three. Sensitive intelligence matters involving active allies are not casually discussed with journalists. When they surface, it is almost always because someone inside the system believes the public interest in knowing outweighs the risk of exposure. That alone tells you something about the level of concern that existed about this specific episode. People do not leak stories they consider unimportant. Consider, too, the timing of the meeting agreed upon between the two nations' leaders, reportedly announced in the very same window as this controversy. On the surface, that might look like nothing more than routine diplomatic scheduling. But in the language of international relations, timing is rarely accidental. A high-profile, friendly meeting announced immediately after an embarrassing and potentially damaging report is also a signal, a way of visually reasserting that the relationship remains solid, regardless of what unnamed officials might be telling reporters behind the scenes. Public optics and private substance often move on separate, carefully managed tracks, and this moment appears to be a textbook example of exactly that kind of dual messaging. None of this exists in a vacuum either. This entire episode is unfolding against the backdrop of a ceasefire that itself remains only partially built. The core framework, a temporary arrangement meant to halt the worst of the fighting, deliberately postponed the most difficult questions for later negotiation. Chief among them, the future of the nuclear program at the heart of the conflict. That is not a minor detail left for another day. It is arguably the single most consequential unresolved issue in the entire conflict. The very question capable of restarting the war at any moment if talks collapse. Every other event in this story, the alleged assassination threat, the warning, the fiery denial, the friction between allies, is happening on top of that unresolved fault line, which means none of it can be viewed as isolated. It is all part of the same fragile structure, and cracks anywhere in that structure put pressure on every other part of it. Even the ceasefire's day-to-day reality has been anything but calm. Reports throughout this period describe continued confrontations in a critical shipping corridor, with attacks and retaliatory strikes continuing even while the broader diplomatic framework technically remained in place. That is the uncomfortable truth about ceasefires in modern conflicts. They rarely mean the complete absence of violence. They mean an agreement to stop the worst of it, while smaller confrontations continue underneath, testing the limits of what each side will tolerate before declaring the whole arrangement dead. A ceasefire like this one is less like a light switch and more like a dimmer, one that can be turned back up gradually, incident by incident, until no one can say exactly when it stopped functioning as a ceasefire at all. Which leads to the final, uncomfortable dimension of this story worth sitting with. Public trust in official denials has eroded significantly over the past decade, across nearly every country involved in this story and far beyond it. When a government says a report is fake news, a complete fabrication, a meaningful portion of the public no longer automatically believes that denial, regardless of which government is speaking or which side of any given conflict they support. That skepticism is not unique to this episode.